Good day to you. Many of you, whether you want to or not, will have been watching some of the proceedings from the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial. Is it not amazing that we are spending so much time as a nation transfixed on two movie actors, albeit, if you know that word, great movie actors, at least in the case of Johnny Depp. Maybe you say so for Amber Heard as well. But isn't it amazing that our nation is so transfixed on movies? It speaks to, I believe, the importance of movies in our culture. In fact, we're heading into the movie season with a hot heat outside where many people are seeking shelter from that heat in movie theaters. And so that's what our subject is all about today as we take on Chapter 7. We're talking about movies today in Intro to Mass Media. And we do go to movies for different reasons. We go to escape life, right? You're in a movie theater and there's this gigantic screen in front of you with people bigger than they are in life, if you were to actually take out a tape measure and measure them. And it's easy to dive right in and get lost as the light goes dark around you and you can't see the people you're sitting next to and your attention is just on the big screen. So we do go to escape life. We also go to the movies to pass time. People who are alone, and I don't mean lonely, but people who are alone, they sometimes go to movies to pass some time. We also go to movies to stimulate romances. It's one of the most traditional first dates that we go on. It's a place where we feel safe to get close to somebody, start to feel whether they feel comfortable around us physically, have a conversation with them where you're not looking at each other directly because you can look at the movie screen, and maybe it leads to further intimacy. It's something that is always a possibility with a date when you go to a movie. Of course, we also seek movies for practical reasons like getting into air conditioning when it's too hot outside, or forcing ourselves to get off of our cell phone. Despite all those trailers that say turn the cell phone off, it's always asking us to turn it on, right? And so to go to a movie means we don't have to do that. What makes movies different from some of the other media that we've studied is movies tend to be edgier than television. So you've got TV, which has changed in years, and we're going to be talking about TV in the next class. But movies tend to be edgier in terms of the real-life experiences or not real-life experiences that are depicted in the movies. They are edgier, they are pushing boundaries more in general than television. And so let's talk about the development of movies as we trace the development of this technology. And we're going to mention Thomas Edison again. Thomas Edison, who has that Thomas Edison National Park just outside of New York City in New Jersey. And he is the one, above all else, who's credited with developing the motion picture industry, the technology and the industry. So let's talk about where Edison comes into play. But before we get to him, let's talk about a Frenchman named Etienne, that's his first name, Etienne, Jules. It's a hyphenated name, Etienne hyphenated Jules Marais. And he developed a system for taking repeated photos of an object, a person, and then when you play back those photos by flipping them, it creates the illusion of that object, that person being in motion. Now, you've probably done that yourself, maybe somewhere along the way in grade school, created cards and you created your own little movie. It was Etienne Jules Marais who invented that idea. Now let's talk about Edward Muybridge. Edward Muybridge, he has a very unusual spelling to his first name, Eadweard. He invented a device called the zoetrope, Zoetrope, the zoetrope, which was an actual machine that would take photos of people in motion on a cylinder. And so the cylinder would spin and a light would project through that cylinder and project the motion on the screen around the cylinder. Edward Muybridge was famous because in California, the governor wanted to settle a bet whether when a horse is galloping, all four hooves are in the air at one time or whether there is always one hoof of a horse on the ground. So Edward Muybridge did this with his filmmaking technique. It wasn't called filmmaking at that time. And he proved that, yes, in fact, a horse does leave the ground at certain moments when it's galloping and there are no feet on the ground, no hoofs on the ground. All right, so these inventions got the industry going as far as the initial ideas and concepts for what this medium is going to look like, but it was Edison's company that took it to the next level because he invented the kinetoscope. Thomas Edison's company, the kinetoscope, Kinetscope. And this was a device that would, well, it was like looking into a viewfinder. It's a big box, and you look down on top, you can see photos of it in today's links and videos of it. And you look into that, it's a very private experience. And some of the early motion, remember that's what we're talking about, motion pictures here. We're talking about film, we're talking about movies. A movie is something that moves, right? Let's not forget what the root words are of the media that we're studying. A movie, something that moves. So Edison first had real life experiences, like a man flexing his muscles. That was really amazing to see. I mean, imagine for the first time in your life, there's a technology that plays back what people look like in motion. Before that, there was just photography. So the kinetoscope became very popular. You can kind of think of a kinetoscope as the forerunner to the Nickelodeon. The Nickelodeon was the same kind of device where you put a nickel in it, and then you could watch a man flexing his muscles. Again, it was very, very raw, but also very amazing to people at that time. And that's where we get Nickelodeon from on NTV today, right? It's an old-style movie projector is really what it is. Now let's go back to France and talk about two early French filmmakers, the Lumiere brothers, as they are known, Lumiere. And their last name is actually used as the unit to measure light today, lumens. I think that's how you say it. That's where it comes from. They invented the cinematograph. What the cinematograph is instead of projecting an image within a box that one person and one person only can see by looking in a viewfinder, now the cinematograph projected the screen, projected the image, projected the motion onto the wall, what would later be a screen. And so this is opening up film now to mass consumption because several people can watch film at one time, although it's still not called film. So this gives rise now to producers and directors of films. And the very first producer we want to highlight is Edwin Porter. Edwin Porter was the first to tell a story using film. Whereas the previous examples of film that we've talked about have to do with real-life experiences like a horse or a man flexing his muscles, now we have storytelling that's taking place in film, and his film is The Great Train Robbery. And it's got all kinds of action in it. It's got bad guys, it's got good guys, it's got gunfights, it's got murder, it's got drama by the way that people are moving their bodies. Remember, film at this time does not have voice to it. That had not been invented yet. So it was basically moving pictures plus a soundtrack that would be dubbed over it. It was the first realistic story that was also a story, right? And that's sort of the main focus of film today, is presenting something that could be realistic. Now let's go on to a controversial filmmaker by the name of D.W. Griffith. He has two initials in his first name. He was the first film director to have a blockbuster. A blockbuster. What is a blockbuster? A blockbuster is an epic film that captures the nation's imagination. It's a film that will live on in infamy, like Gone with the Wind, for example, for good or bad reasons, that one, because of the racism in it. But also films like Star Wars, for example, or Jaws. These are epic films that tap into something deeper than other films, and they have kind of like a lifelong lease on popularity. The first films that D.W. Griffith was developing were an hour long, and so this is what led to films being called feature-length films, which today are around 2 hours. D.W. Griffith's film, and the reason that he's a controversial director, is called Birth of a Nation. It was put out in 1915, Birth of a Nation, and it told the story of the rise of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, in the years following the Civil War. Now, depending on your vantage point, some people say this is a racist film. It portrays black people as beasts and black people attacking the North. That's what some people say. Others say, no, this film is merely a documentary on the time period. And in order to accurately capture the racism that existed, D.W. Griffith had that film. Check this film out. When you watch it in the link, fast forward to different points in the film. Watch a few seconds. I'm not expecting you to watch the whole thing. And you'll get a feeling of how African Americans are portrayed. And you'll also get a feeling of the drama that's inherent in this kind of film storytelling in the beginning. D.W. Griffith also was responsible for the rise of, quote, the movie star. The movie star. Prior to D.W. Griffith, actors did not get credit in movies, and so they wouldn't ask for more money. That's why they didn't get credit, so they wouldn't ask for money. They were secondary. And this was because of a system that existed called the studio system. The studio system was where films were made in New York and New Jersey. That's where films were first made in the early 1900s, just outside of New Jersey, where Thomas Edison's National Park is. And these films would be released by the studio, MGM, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, whatever, and then those films would have to be accepted by theater owners. And you would have to purchase a whole slate of films, even if there were a couple lemons in there, films that were not made that well. You had to purchase all 12 films or nothing, and you didn't even get a chance to view them. And in that system, actors were paid, but they were like assembly line workers. They were controlled by the studio, their lifestyles, what they would get paid, where they could go, etc., and they weren't credited. That all changed with D.W. Griffith. He started to promote the whole concept of a star. And his first movie star was Florence Griffith. Florence Griffith, and now movie stars are starting to get the big money because they make the film, and they're also starting to be part of the marketing of the film as well, today going on talk shows, etc. Now let's talk about a group that changed the face of the filmmaking industry called United Artists. You probably recognize that group, United Artists. These were a group of actors mainly who resented the control that the studio system had over their lives, forcing them to make films, for example. So this group of people formed United Artists. It consisted of D.W. Griffith. It also consisted of Charlie Chaplin, who's a famous comedic actor from Britain. He's a silent black and white film actor doing comedy. And this group became United Artists, and they moved the industry, guess where? To Hollywood, California. They moved to Hollywood, California. Why was Hollywood, California such a great place? It's for several reasons. One is the landscape there lends itself to many different kinds of scenarios. You've got the mountains, you've got the beach, you've got suburbia, you've got the ocean. There are many different kinds of scenarios that you can recreate in Hollywood. Plus, it was wide open as far as the land at that time, so land was not expensive. Plus, it's a fair weather climate, so you can shoot all year round in California. Now let's talk about the next development in the technology of films. We're going to talk about talking pictures now. Up until 1927, there was no such thing as a picture or a movie where you would have voice talk. You would have voices in that film, at least coming from the actors. That all changed in 1927 with the release of a film called The Jazz Singer. The Jazz Singer in 1927, it was sort of a talkie, but really it was a silent film that had 2 talking segments that were edited into the film. Nevertheless, it broke ground. But it wasn't until the film Don Juan that came out shortly after where you have the actual first synchronized soundtrack. And that is the term that's used to describe the process of matching voice to music over the background of film visuals. Synchronized soundtrack. That's syncing voices and pictures. Don Juan was the first to do that. So the studio system was already in trouble when United Artists moved everybody out to California, but the end of the studio system was facilitated by a couple court cases and laws. So the first one is 1938. In 1938, the Department of Justice was concerned about the monopolies of film studios. So they made a ruling in 1938 said that studios have to do limited block bookings. A block booking is where you would say, okay, we're going to force this movie theater to take all 12 films. No. And also theater owners were allowed to see the films before booking them. So that was a big change in the structure of the Hollywood industry. Also in 1948, you have a second law where the Supreme Court actually ruled that studios must sell their theaters. So now theaters could operate independently. That's why you have like an AMC theater now that's completely separate from movie producers and movie studios. I'd like to talk about a dark period in American film history now, the Blacklist era. The Blacklist was about communism. Communism after World War II was feared by a lot of Americans. There was a senator named Joseph McCarthy who was outing people who were allegedly communists. And 10 people who were Hollywood actors and scriptwriters were identified as potential communist sympathizers. And they were called before Congress to answer questions, but they refused. And because they refused, they were jailed. And then after they were let out of jail, they appeared on a blacklist where they were not welcome to work for movies. And that blacklist, by the way, grew to 324 people when we talk about the communist scare. So 324 people could not find work in Hollywood because they were part of this blacklist. Now let's move to talking about how television threatened movies. In the 1950s, we already know that television is coming on the scene. We haven't started talking about TV yet. We'll do that next class. But television comes on in the 1950s, and because you also have a change in the demographics of the United States, in many ways, I won't say reversing industrialization, but at least changing industrialization. Remember, industrialization is where people are moving to the cities. Well, what starts to happen in the 1950s is people start to move out of the cities. They don't want the crime, they don't want the dense population, they don't want the noise, they don't want the cost, so they start to move out into suburbs. And that is the way that America is largely structured today. You have many people living in suburbs. Some are gated communities, etc. These suburbs are located away from places to walk to, right? You have to get in a car and drive somewhere, even to a convenience store. That's the way that most of America is structured around the automobile. So in the 1950s, TV had great appeal because television is appearing in people's houses, and now they can watch something that looks like a movie. It is a movie, but it's not on the big screen. But they don't have to get in the car and go into a city. And so television started to threaten movie-going attendance. In fact, movie audiences peaked in 1946 with 80 million tickets sold per week, 80 million tickets sold per week. But by 1953, with TV coming onto the scene, the number of tickets sold per week was down to 46 million, almost half as left. So Hollywood started to scramble, started to wonder, how can we combat this exodus of people to television in the suburbs? And it reacted by producing larger-than-life movies for a start. So a larger-than-life movie is a movie that has a set that just is bigger than actual life can be. The very first film, which you can see in the link that does this, or one of the primary films that did this, was Spartacus, which takes place in Spartan Greece and showing the Spartan army, starring Kirk Douglas. And in this film, if you look at the sets, which are fake, they are expansive. And there are thousands of soldiers out there. And that's not something you see in real life. And that's not something that television could replicate, because TV at that time was a small rectangular box compared to the big screen. So Hollywood reacted with larger-than-life movies. And then secondly, Hollywood also invented 3D films, which television could not do. You have to put on the special glasses. So 3D kind of, languished for many years, and then sort of tried to make a comeback in the last 10 years, but it was actually around in early Hollywood film going. Also, Hollywood started to use color in films, which was very expensive and is still expensive as a production process. At that time, you had to have 3 different reels in order to create color. But nevertheless, it appeared to be very appealing to moviegoers in films like Gone with the Wind and Wizard of Oz. All right, next up we're going to talk about the growth of multiplex theaters. These are theaters that show several films throughout the course of the day, and sometimes you'll find the same film being shown twice. One is in 3D, one is not. One is has a Spanish language subtitling, one does not. You can find all kinds of films in there. And so the the multiplex theater complex started to attach itself to malls. Again, a feature of suburban living, people living in suburbs and driving out to the mall. Now let's talk about the movie business as an industry. We're going to start with the blockbuster era. And it was actually Steven Spielberg's 1975 film Jaws, which created the blockbuster era. Now, we had already talked about how D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation was a blockbuster, but now we get a whole string of blockbuster hits coming out in the 70s. These are big summer movies. It's a movie that is teased all year long for a release in the summer, and you can find that even today. And so blockbuster films were created by Jaws, and the impact of Jaws is amazing. I know people still today who won't go in the water at the beach because they're afraid that there's a shark out there. Truly amazing that this many years later, from 1975, people are still affected by that film Jaws. Anyway, there were lots of other blockbusters in the 70s, including Star Wars. And then later on, we have other blockbuster films that continue the tradition, like Indiana Jones, Spider-Man, Pirates of the Caribbean. There's a Johnny Depp film series, Dark Knight, Twilight, the Final Destination series. These are all part of blockbuster era. Now let's talk about another threat to the movie industry. This is the home video recorder. It started out as a VCR, video cassette recorder. You remember how I mentioned during audio or in our last class how magnetic tape allowed for new editing techniques in the sound studio? Well, VCRs used a magnetic tape also. They used a video cassette recorder, and you could tape anything off of the air. You could tape a movie off of television, then you could watch it on your VCR. You could also go rent VCRs from companies like Blockbuster, which has now gone out of business, was replaced by Netflix. The penetration of VCRs into homes was so rapid that by 1995, 85% of all homes had a VCR. Truly amazing how quickly this medium penetrated the average American's existence. This kind of technology opened up movies to brand new audiences. It allowed people who didn't have the time to go to a movie theater, didn't have a car to go to a movie theater, people who wanted to see movies that had their runs 20 years ago and now they're on video cassette. Yeah, it opened up new audiences. Just like we can say that media platforms today are opening up new audiences also for movies on Netflix and Hulu and Amazon and all the other platforms. Eventually the DVD did replace the video cassette recorder and the VHS tape, and then now everything's on the cloud, basically on Netflix and all these other streaming services. So a question that we want to raise now is, what makes a movie profitable today? Because only 20 to 30% of movies actually make money. That's why it's such a big risk. That's why movie makers have to get producers. They have to get people to finance the movie, and those producers are taking a chance. If they end up with a blockbuster, they strike it rich, but they could also end up with a dud, since only 20 to 30% of movies make money, because there's so much cost involved in the production, the distribution of the film, the star salaries for sure, and promotion is very, very high. So the biggest way that you can produce a blockbuster today is with big stars and a big name director. That's why Johnny Depp is having this lawsuit purportedly, because he's arguing that he was denied another run with Pirates of the Caribbean because of an op-ed that Amber Heard wrote. So that's what the court case is about. It speaks to this idea of big stars making a film. But also movie makers make money today by selling licensed products, T-shirts, for example, DVDs, and all kinds of other memorabilia, all kinds of merch, you want to look at that way. Also, foreign box office receipts can redeem a film. Some films don't do well in the U.S., they do really well overseas, like Rambo. Actually, Rambo was a film that did do well in the United States, but also did really well overseas. And I've traveled, in many places across the world. In almost every place that I've been, there is a theater that has an American film that's showing right that day that I'm in that country. There are some successes that are unexpected, like Black Panther. That was a big success. That had a production budget of $200 million, which sounds like a lot of money, but it's not in the filmmaking area, but it actually brought in $659 million domestically and $1.34 million globally. Now let's turn to the larger question of the impact of movies on society. How much influence do movies have? That's a big question. People are wondering all the time about whether murders are committed by people who watch too many movies and or video games, whether people get addicted to drugs, whether people commit infidelity, whether people get up to bad behavior in general because of film. So one of the early studies took a look at a film called It Happened One Night with a movie star called Clark Gable. And in that film, he took off his shirt, and to the surprise of the audience, he was not wearing an undershirt, a white undershirt, which was standard clothing for men in the 1940s. It's called a wife beater today, which is a terrible name for it. I'm just trying to get you to understand what the shirt was. But when Clark Gable took off his shirt, he wasn't wearing one. And so an analysis was done of sales of that white shirt, and those sales plummeted because supposedly young males were copying Clark Gable, who was supposedly a handsome movie star. There were some other studies done by the Payne Fund, P-A-Y-N-E, Payne Fund, in the 1920s, and they found that 3/4 of all movies deal with crime, sex, and love. Probably still true today, right? So movies were thought of, at least at that time, as responsible for the moral decay of society because the standards of actors tended to be lower than regular people. You can answer that question for yourself. Do movie actors live by different standards than the regular person? Now let's move on to Bollywood. You may not know about Bollywood. You may think that Hollywood is the biggest filmmaking industry in the entire world because it has such an impact on the world, but it is not. The actual biggest producing film industry is in Bollywood, India. Bollywood, India, in the city of Mumbai, which is formerly Bombay, India. In that city, over 1,000 films on average are produced per year, as opposed to Hollywood, where you have around 800 films. Probably the most common film or the most popular film that you may know about that's a Bollywood film is Slumdog Millionaire. Slumdog Millionaire. One difference between Bollywood films and Hollywood films is you can have 10 storylines in a Bollywood film, and in Hollywood you're going to have maybe 2 or 3. Also in Bollywood there's no kissing in those films, and in fact they're much more conservative sexually than Hollywood films. Now let's move to the subject of diversity, a subject that we addressed throughout this class, diversity in movies. Until recently, the Oscars was criticized as being mostly white. The Oscars is the premier celebration of actor talents by awarding the Oscar award. But the problem is most of those actors were white. Now this year we had the Will Smith and Chris Rock episode showing that things have changed quite a bit, but it doesn't change the fact that in Hollywood there has been a lot of whitewashing, where actual people of color, where people of color are cast by white actors, where actors are cast to act out people of color. So let's move on now to protecting movies from censorship. There has been a strong effort by the movie industry not to be censored because of the way that films were perceived by the American public as contributing to the moral decay. But that doesn't mean that the motion picture industry was ready for government to come in and censor films. And so you do have an active effort by filmmaking to avoid censorship. In 1909, theater owners formed something called the National Board of Censorship to try and establish national standards for movies. And these standards prohibited prostitution, childbirth, birth by somebody younger than 16, 17, masturbation, and drug use. All of these were prohibited. But behaviors of actors off the screen were still getting entangled in scandal, proving that whatever they were doing on the screen was not how they really were in life. Then we have the motion picture industry, the forerunner to the MPCC. The motion picture industry was founded by Will Hayes, who was a U.S. postmaster, and that controlled the content of movies until 1968. And the mission of this organization was to get evil not to be made to look alluring. Crime should not inspire imitation. Lawbreakers should not go unpunished in film stories and film plots. That's what the motion picture industry was all about. Then we have the latest iteration of that organization called the MPCC, Motion Picture, I can't remember what the last 2 letters stand for. And this is the organization that developed the rating system for films. G for general audiences, PG for parental guidance, PG-13 for parents, strongly cautioned, R for 17, accompanied by adult, NC-17 for no one under the age of 17. And then we have triple X, XXX, which is not an official rating, but it's the pornography industry's tongue-in-cheek commentary on the filmmaking industry, because the MPCC patented all those other ratings, but they didn't patent XXX, and that's where the pornography industry stepped in and said, we're going to claim that. And that's why XXX is used for pornography today. All right, now let's talk about the future of movies. Always difficult to discuss the future of technology in this class, but we do know that movies are going to continue to have a relationship with the internet. Right now, for the most part, the internet provides trailers for films. That's what gets people interested in films, and then you have to go purchase the film somewhere. You can get free films on YouTube and other places, but for the most part, you're going to end up purchasing a film through subscriptions, or you're going to purchase a pay-per-view type film. We also know that movies will continue to have a place on television through pay-per-view, through premium channels like HBO and Showtime, like also on home video. We also know that television is going to play a role in that, where films can be played back on TV that were released in theaters. We also know that movies are going to continue with their branding associations, so toys and clothes will still take place, as well as product placement. Product placement is where an advertiser pays to have their product prominently displayed in a film. That's what happened with the Jurassic Park films. You can see Mercedes is prominently displayed in there with the Mercedes logo. They paid for that. And then we also have licensing. Film soundtracks are used in video games. Video games have to pay for that licensing. So as we head into the future, it's up to you to consider where the movie is headed, but you have some ideas to get you started. Have a great day.